Hi everyone, this is Eli from the Whale Shark and Oceanic Research Center, and today we're going to be talking about Caribbean reef fish identification for local species here in Utila. Before I start, I wanted to acknowledge that this isn't necessarily every single species of fish that you're going to find here in Utila. There are many more, but this is a good start for research and conservation in this area if you are interested. If you're one of our interns watching this or are interested in remembering these fish species for later on in life, make sure you pay attention to the identifying characteristics of each species, the dive signal for each one, like the angelfish there, and also the memory techniques we use to remember each one. So with all of that being said, let's go ahead and start with the first group of fish. So the very first group of fish we're going to talk about are the angelfish. So the sign for angelfish underwater is this, like a halo around the head, like an angel. And you'll see that the top two species there look really similarly to one another, the French and the gray. The main distinguishing characteristic from the French and the gray angelfish, because they can look quite similarly underwater, is those golden speckles all across the sides of the fish. That's the first thing that we look for in distinguishing the French from the gray, because they are quite similar in size and shape. Also, for the juveniles of the French and the gray angelfish, you'll notice that they look extremely similar, except the French angelfish has a golden ring around the tail. We like to think of the French as romantics, so they like to put a ring around the tail of the fish. We also think of the French angelfish adult version as a French starry night sky. Next is the rock beauty. You'll notice that this one looks quite different from the rest. It also looks quite different from many other species of fish on the reef. The rock beauty we like to think of as a punk rock enthusiast, so she's always got black lipstick on her lips. Also a very large black patch towards the back of the body. You'll notice that with French gray and rock beauty angelfish, you'll notice that they are often found in pairs. You'll almost always find two of them together, and that's because they form long-term bonds between the male and females. For the queen angelfish is quite different looking from the other angelfish because of its very bright colors, leading it to being named the queen of the angelfish. The queen angelfish also has a crown on top of her head, so sometimes they'll do queen angelfish. You'll notice that the crown on top of the queen angelfish's head is dark blue in color, and you'll see lots of bright yellows and blues across the adult version as well. So next up we have the barracuda. So the sign for barracuda underwater is going to be this, referring to the bars that you normally find on the sides of the barracuda. The great barracuda actually looks quite similarly to another species you're going to see later in this presentation, the cerro. But the barracuda is going to have dark bars along its sides that you can sometimes see more clearly some days than others. But it's also going to have some black splotches along the sides of the fish as well. They also tend to have a very pointy, grumpy face. They don't look like very happy fish. They can also grow to be quite large, up to 6 feet or 2 meters. Next up we have one of our basslets that we have here in Utila, and that's the fairy basslet. So the signal for that one underwater is this, like twirling around a wand, like a little fairy. The fairy basslet looks quite different from other fish on the reef because of its very stark contrast from the front to the end of the fish, with purple on the front of the fish and yellow towards the tail. They're about this big, and you often find them along walls and on the undersides of coral reefs. Next up we have a really big favorite on the reef, and that is the boxfish. The signal for boxfish underwater is this. So among the 4 boxfish that we have, you'll notice that they look quite similarly to one another. The smooth and the spotted trunkfish especially look quite similarly to one another. Distinguishing those two from one another, the first thing that we notice is that the smooth trunkfish has a black underlying color with white spots, and then the spotted trunkfish has white with black spots, so kind of an opposite there. The smooth trunkfish also has a few other identifying characteristics, with these big lips around its mouth, and also a small hexagonal shaped pattern right behind that pectoral fin, so kind of like a honeycomb kind of pattern. The spotted trunkfish does not have those big lips. It also doesn't have that honeycomb pattern behind the pectoral fin, and it has those black spots on white and a white underlying color. The scrawled cowfish is called the cowfish because of its horns on top of its head. So whenever we see a cowfish, we'll often do this for cowfish underwater. The scrawled cowfish has a beautiful blue scrawled kind of pattern across its body. We like to think of it as scrawled writing across the body of the fish. You'll notice that there is another scrawled common name for another fish later in this presentation, and it also has that blue kind of scribbly looking pattern across the body. The honeycomb cowfish is called the honeycomb cowfish because, first of all, the honeycomb pattern across the entire body, as well as the cowfish show the horns on top of the head. So very clear name, very clear naming for that one there, so it makes it a little bit easier to remember that one. Don't get confused with the smooth and honeycomb cowfish with the honeycomb patterning. The smooth only has honeycomb patterning just behind the pectoral fin. The honeycomb cowfish has honeycomb all across the body. Next up, we have another favorite on the reef, and that is the butterflyfish. This is a signal underwater, like a butterfly. The butterflyfish, interesting fact about them is they also are found to mate in for long periods of time, sometimes for the majority of their adult life. So you'll often find butterflyfish in pairs throughout the reef. They're also small corallivores, so you'll see them picking on corals and eating them. First up on the top left there is the four-eyed butterflyfish, named for its large eye-like pattern towards the tail. You'll see that that big black spot is on both sides of the tail, or just before the tail, and it's used as a sort of adaptation in case a predator comes from behind thinking that it's the head, and it's easier for the butterflyfish to swim away. Next up is the spotfin butterflyfish, and you'll notice all the way at the top of the fish, the dorsal fin, all the way towards the back, there's a small black spot that gives its name, the spotfin butterflyfish. Also see bright yellow colors, almost highlighter color, on the outer edges of this fish. Next is the banded butterflyfish, named very simply for the big black bands you see across the body. After that is the long snout butterflyfish, named of course for the long snout on its body, which it uses to peck at corals and eat specific coral polyps. The long snout butterflyfish, interestingly, on our island specifically, is only really found on the north side of our island. You really can't find it on the south side. Next up is another cool species, which is the conger eel, or specifically the garden eel here in Utila. So the garden eel is a unique kind of fish where you, at a distance, might see in a big sand patch, it looks like there's a lot of seagrass growing, but you get closer and all of a sudden that seagrass is gone. You were probably looking at a patch or a small community of garden eels, which like to retreat into their holes in the sand whenever you get close to them to protect themselves. The garden eel kind of altogether looks like a garden of seagrass, so hence where they get the name from. Next up we have the damselfish. So the damselfish sign underwater in scuba is this, like a damsel in distress. So there are a lot of species here, so let's break them down. So first we have the dusky damselfish. The dusky damselfish does not have any unique patterning on it. It is strictly a small damselfish with just black color all across the body. There's no specific patterning with it. The thing that we use to distinguish the dusky from some of the other damselfish is first of all from the dorsal fin that has a very right angle towards the end of the dorsal fin, and it abruptly ends at the caudal peduncle, or right where the tail, right where the rays of the fin on the tail meet the body of the fish. That's called the caudal peduncle. You'll notice that the three spot looks quite similarly to the dusky damselfish. However, the name three spot refers to three spots that are found on each of the bases of the pectoral fin, as well as the base of the tail. You'll see three black spots, which you can see in this picture here. Two of those on the pectoral and towards the tail. Now for the Bow Gregory damselfish, we don't see very many of these in Utila, but they are present The Beau Gregory damselfish is one of the biggest characteristics with this one is the large blue spots across the dorsal side of the fish that kind of give it a speckly kind of pattern to it. Next is the bicolor damselfish. The bicolor damselfish is named very simply for its black and white coloration with a very stark contrast of two colors on the fish as an adult. As a juvenile, you'll notice that some of the fish will have a lighter underside, sometimes yellow to orange coloration. This is still a bicolor damselfish, just a juvenile version. Next up is the cocoa damselfish, and I like to think of the cocoa damselfish as a little cocoa latte, where the underside of the fish is going to be that creamy, milky latte kind of color, where the dark side on the top is going to be cocoa sprinkled on the top of it. Next is the long-fin damselfish. The long-fin damselfish is named for its long dorsal and anal fins that will extend past the tail and usually be kind of loby, where they're kind of flopping in the water as they swim. This is where the name comes from. Sometimes we'll pull on the ear to emphasize that it's a long fin damselfish underwater. Another interesting thing about damselfish before I move on to the next slide is that they play a really interesting role in the reef in being algae farmers. They are herbivores and like to maintain a small patch of the reef to maintain an algae patch. So they play an interesting role in the reef in basically keeping everything else out of the reef so they can grow their little patch of algae and farm it. Next is a few more damselfish, and these ones look a little bit different from the ones that we just saw. The Sergeant Major is we like to think of it as always wearing a very pressed uniform that's very organized. He's got dark bars all across the body and a yellow shading across the top of the body. You'll also find that Sergeant Majors normally spend most of their time off the reef and in the water column. When you pull up on a dive site, you'll often see a large school of them pulling around your boat. Next is the yellowtail damselfish, named very simply for the very bright yellow tail, as well as that being the major characteristic. The yellowtail damselfish is also quite large compared to the other damselfish. As a juvenile, this is a large favorite for people visiting this island and the Caribbean in general. They call it the disco fish because it looks like a little disco ball with dark blue and very bright iridescent blue speckles all across the body. Next we have the chromises. So there's two chromises that we have here in Utila, the blue chromis and the brown chromis. They really look identical in shape to each other, they just have different coloration. The blue chromis really looks like it would be blue chrome. It is super bright and reflective underwater, and usually you'll find them in schools together. They're pretty small fish that are about this big, and they're a very pretty fish. Another thing with the chromises that I like to point out is that the tails are they branch very abruptly. You can see that the two lobes of the fin, the upper and lower, are very much going in very pointed different directions. The brown chromis is it's just easier to think of the blue chromis first, and then the brown chromis is just a chromis without color. Next up we have the spotted drum, the type of drum that we have here in Utila. Big favorite on the reef, and not necessarily one you have to spend a lot of time remembering because this is just a really big favorite on the reef. The spotted drum has a beautiful spotted pattern towards the tail as an adult, and they also have that characteristic big flail, or I don't know how you want to call it, a big hat on its head that they maintain as juveniles and adults. The juvenile is a really cute, super cool thing to find on the reef. Everyone loves a good spotted drum. Next we have the filefish. So the sign for filefish underwater is this, and I forgot, sorry, real quick, the spotted drum. This is the sign for drum underwater. So filefish, we have two main types of filefish here. So the first one is the scrawled filefish, and like I was saying with that other scrawled fish, the scrawled filefish has that same blue, kind of scribbly, scrawled blue patterning all across the body. A scrawled filefish can also get quite large. Next is the slender filefish. This one is very much smaller than the scrawled filefish. It still has that diamond kind of shape of a filefish, but it is just much smaller. You'll often find the slender filefish among seed plumes, or we also find them on our coral nurseries all the time. They like to hang out and hang vertically to blend in with their surroundings. They have a small file on top of their head, both of the filefish there, that they can use as a form of communication for other filefish. And they also have little, not appendages, but little extensions of their body all around to help them blend in with their surroundings. Next up, we have two more filefish. We have two more filefish here, the orange-spotted and the white-spotted filefish. The orange-spotted filefish, you normally can't see the orange spots on the body, but normally you would find orange spots all across the body if it's displaying some kind of communication to other fish, or if it's agitated, angry, or trying to feed, you can see those orange spots. But normally you're just going to see a darkish purpley brown with yellow stripes across the body, and of course the file on top of the head for the that filefish. Next is the white-spotted filefish, and the same kind of thing. You don't normally see those white spots unless it is excited or agitated in some kind of way. Normally you just see it with black, white, and orange. And the way that I like to think of the white-spotted filefish and how I remember is the big white patch towards the middle of the body that I think of a big white spot. Next we have one of the flounders that we have here in Utila. This is what I do for flounder underwater, like a pancake. The peacock flounder has a very peacock-like pattern all across the body. They're usually quite bland and also quite small. You'll normally find them in sand patches on the reef. Next is the flying fish, the Atlantic flying fish that we have here in Utila. This is something that you're not normally going to see on the reef, but driving over to a reef, you will probably see a few of them come out of the water. So next we have the goatfish. So we have two types of goatfish here in Utila, that is the spotted and the yellow goatfish. The spotted goatfish is normally, both goatfish, are normally feeding on the sea floor, and they'll be using those little the little extensions on their below their mouth, below their jaw, to basically sift through the sand and find different kinds of prey. The spotted goatfish has 3 spots on the body, and the rest of the body is white. The yellow goatfish just has one yellow stripe across the center of the body and a big yellow tail. You'll notice that this guy looks very much like the yellowtail snapper. Distinguishing the two of them, the yellow goatfish is always going to be feeding or residing towards the sea floor because that's where they find their food. The yellowtail snapper is much more normally out in the water column, living its life over there instead of on the sea floor. Next we have the grunts. So the sign for grunts underwater is going to be this. We have a lot of species of grunts here, so let's break them down. So first there on the top left is the blue striped grunt. So the blue striped grunt has bright blue stripes across the body. Although this can be quite easy to confuse with some of the other grunts because that blue can look silver at times. So let's talk about how you distinguish that. So the blue striped grunt has parallel stripes along the body for the most part. They're going to be horizontal and completely not running into each other along the body. The blue striped grunt is also a little bit larger than some of the other types of grunts that we see here. The French grunt can commonly be confused for the blue striped grunt because the silver stripes on the blue striped grunt can sometimes look blue. However, the French grunt, we always like to think of the busy intersections of France, or a busy intersection in France where they're normally running into each other, where you have a intersection. So sometimes we'll do like this underwater for a French grunt. They're also a little bit smaller than the blue-striped grunt. So those yellow stripes are going to be running into each other on the French grunt. Then we have the white grunt. So the white grunt has pattern on its face, but then the rest of its body you don't see any patterning. Also with the white grunt, they are much larger than the blue-striped and French grunt and most of these other grunts here, and they're also normally solitary. You never really see them with other types of, or with other white grunts. Then we have the Caesar grunt. So the Caesar grunt is unique in that it has these black splotches across the body. So all along the belly and around the fins there is black splotching, giving them a unique coloration. So next we have the tomtate. The tomtate is a little bit difficult to identify because it is quite bland. It has some of the characteristics of all of the other grunts here, but it doesn't have very many unique ones. The big unique one that I can point out is the big defined yellow stripe across the center of the body going through the eye, and also sometimes having a darker tail as well. They're also quite smaller than the other grunts. Next is the Spanish grunt. The Spanish grunt is also normally found by itself. It's also a bit larger of a grunt, and you have a dark coloration, kind of brownish purple, with a yellow backside, so quite unique compared to the other colors of the other grunts. Next is a few more grunts. So these ones are a bit more unique. So the porkfish, I always think of it, has a slab of bacon on its face. So the porkfish has got a big black band across the face. It also has a much more elevated, much larger backside than the other grunts. The white margate and the black margate are quite similar looking to one another. The white margate is very much a fish that doesn't have very many defining characteristics other than its shape. The backside is a little bit more humped, and normally you'll see the darker blackish coloration towards the dorsal tail, the dorsal fin towards the back, as well as the tail. They'll also normally be schooling together, both the white and the black margate, although I sometimes find the black margate by itself. So the black margate is unique in that it has a big black patch across the belly, and you'll often find them schooling as well. So next up on our fish identification list is the jacks. So sometimes we do this underwater for jacks, and sometimes people do this, referring to the very branched tail, or the very defined tail. So one of the most common species of jack here that we have in Utila is definitely the bar jack, which you can sometimes find in schools, also sometimes find by themselves. So the bar jack, I always like to think of having a bright blue bar across the dorsal side of the fish. They're also quite football shaped, and very much silver. Sometimes you will also find them quite dark in coloration as well. Normally when I see them darker in coloration, there's only one or two of them, and they're also quite large. Sometimes you'll also find barjacks in an interesting kind of mutualistic relationship with stingrays, where the stingray will feed in the sand and the barjack will be hunting along its back, waiting for things to be unearthed in the sand around it. Next is the horse-eyed jack. So the horse-eyed jack is named after the very large eye that kind of resembles a horse's eye. But another defining characteristic with the horse-eyed jack that I like to look for is that bright yellow tail, which is unique for among this group of fish. Next is the permit. So the permit is quite large, and it also has a very unique shape in being kind of like almost stop sign shaped, or very much like the shape of, in America, a permit is like a license. So kind of like in the shape of a permit, where it's very kind of four defined points to it, like a permit that you get to drive your car. The permit sometimes also has a little bit of yellow on the belly, and it has that very defined large Y-shaped black tail. Next is the jawfish. So the jawfish is a type of fish that likes to spend a lot of its time in a hole. Normally you'll only see the top of the fish poking out of the sand. It's very rare to actually see the entire body like this picture here. There's also a lot of other species of jawfish in Utila. This is just the one that we like to point out, as it tends to be a favorite for locals here visiting. Next is the lizardfish. So sometimes they'll do this underwater for lizardfish, because this is lizard in sign language. The lizardfish, or sand diver, is a unique kind of fish because it doesn't move very much until it is hunting. It is an ambush predator, so it'll spend a lot of its time just kind of hanging out in the sand there, planted with its fins towards the bottom of the body. They have a very lizard-like looking face, very reptilian. They also have some green coloration across the body, which also resembles a lizard as well. Another interesting thing about the lizardfish is under a black light, they will actually light up with a yellowish green coloration. Here's another large silverfish. This is the one that I was mentioning, looked a little bit like a barracuda. Differentiating the barracuda from the cerro. The cerro has a little bit less patterning across the body. You don't see black bars like in the barracuda, and you also don't see those big black splotches. The cerro is also much more silvery and reflective, like other mackerels. The cerro, sometimes they do a big C underwater for the sign for that fish. And you'll notice that the face also looks quite different, in being a little bit less grumpy looking than a barracuda. The tail is also much larger and much thinner, in width at least, than the barracuda as well. Next group of species that we're going to talk about are the Moray Eels. This is the sign for eels underwater. So we have 4 main species of Moray Eels here, and probably the most common of which is the green moray. This is also the largest of all the morays that we have here. They can get very large, and they get their name, of course, from their green coloration, which comes from a mucus on their skin. Next up, I'm going to talk about is the chain moray eel. The chain moray eel is unique because it has a gold chain-like pattern all across the body. You'll see that it's kind of looping golden circles across the body, but some of them overlap. It really looks like a gold chain all across the body. Next is the spotted moray eel. The spotted moray eel is named very simply for the Dalmatian-like spotted pattern all across the body. So black on white spots, or black spots on white. Next up is the golden tail moray eel. A golden tail that you probably, the actual tail of which you probably won't see very often, but you will often see the head. This is a smaller moray eel that really looks like it has gold glitter all across its face. That's the word. It normally is just poking its head out. I've never seen the whole body of a golden tail moray eel. They're also much smaller, and they have the golden glitter across their face and a brownish kind of underlying color. Next up is another favorite of the reef, and that is the parrotfish. So like a pirate and a parrot on the shoulder, that's the sign underwater for a parrotfish. This is a very unique group of fish because they change a lot of their biology from the beginning of their life to the end of their life. And I'll explain why we have male and female on there in a second. So the parrotfish is a really unique fish in that the juveniles are majority female. Almost all of the juvenile parrotfish that you're going to see are females, while the adults are generally male. So this is a really big evolutionary adaptation to have lots of females in the population and very few males, so that the male can very easily populate or very easily fertilize as many females as possible to support the population. It would be much harder for there to be a lot of males and only a few females, because there can only be so many males that can fertilize the eggs of one female. If you have more females, you have more eggs, and therefore you can get more offspring. So another interesting thing about parrotfish is that they change their color and pattern pretty dramatically from the juvenile female stage to the adult male stage. In the striped parrotfish, you'll see that there is a brown and white striped pattern across the body and a golden nose. In the adult parrotfish, or in the male version, the striped parrotfish has lots of blues and pinks, and we like to think of differentiating the princess and the striped, as the striped is going to have a big red splotch kind of bleeding down the side that starts from the eyes. It goes from the eyes all the way across the side of the body. And you'll notice that the princess parrotfish, the male version, looks quite similarly. And differentiating the two, the princess parrotfish, the adult version, has a gold blush on the side as well as pink kind of outlining the tail. So we like to think of that as the princess wearing pink eyeliner. She likes to wear pink eyeliner, so just on the outlines of the tail you get the pink. In the juvenile version of the princess parrotfish, it's a very different looking fish, and you see very bright kind of neon-like green on the dorsal tail and the dorsal fin and the anal fin, and you get a lot of pink along the body as well. You can kind of see a little bit of the patterning happening, but otherwise the adult is much easier, the male is much easier to identify. And now moving on to the queen parrotfish. So the male and the female look quite different from one another. The queen male parrotfish, often it looks like, has teal eyeliner around the eyes and teal lipstick around the mouth. The female version looks like it has black eyeliner around the eyes and black and white around the body, much less impressive coloration and patterning as the full adult male version. Next is a few more parrotfish. So first up is the red band. So the red band, a male version, has a big red band from the mouth, kind of like a tribal looking kind of pattern, I like to think of it. And the female version is very brightly colored, very brightly patterned. You normally see it having blues and greens and reds kind of mishmashed all on there that help it kind of blend into both the coral reef and seagrasses where it moves between in this stage of life, in the younger stage of life. For the red-tailed parrotfish, the red-tailed parrotfish is majorly named for its mostly red tail. There is a little bit of orange as well, but the easiest identifying characteristic is that big red line towards the end of the tail. The female version is very pretty. You can think of the red tail juvenile female being in the younger stages of a red-tailed parrotfish's life. There's red all over the body, and then in the male adult version, the red concentrates in the end of the tail. So the female is all pink, the male, all of that red is concentrated in one area in the tail. For the stoplight parrotfish, this is probably the largest and most common parrotfish on our reefs. The stoplight parrotfish is named for that very big, bright yellow stoplight looking light towards the tail, towards the caudal peduncle. And in the female version, the younger version, you get very different patterning, kind of like a corn on the cob kind of patterning all across the body, as well as a very bright red towards the stomach. Next is two more parrotfish. This is the yellowtail parrotfish. Interesting thing about the yellowtail parrotfish, as the older females tend to school. This is not a normal behavior for parrotfish we found on the reef. This is the only larger parrotfish that we see ever aggregating in schools on the reef. For the male parrotfish, the male yellowtail parrotfish, you can see that it is majorly, there's no identifying characteristics besides a very bright yellow tail. The rest of the body is quite all the same color with a tealish kind of color. The female also still has the yellow tail. It just looks a little bit different across the body, where you can clearly see the scales, and it's very much gray. So moving on from the parrotfish, we now have the porcupinefish. So the porcupinefish sign for the sign for porcupinefish underwater is this, because they can inflate. The first one we have is the porcupinefish, which gets much larger than you would think. The porcupinefish can get very large, and you'll often find one or two of them together. I feel like more oftentimes you'll just find one. The porcupinefish I like to think of as the end quills of a porcupine. Like the bases of the quills are all of those black spots all across the body. And they get as large or larger as a porcupine. The balloonfish I like to think of is it has some popped balloons across its body, so you'll see some brown bands across the body that you can think of as popped brown balloons. The balloonfish is also much smaller than the porcupinefish, getting about this big. And they also have a very unique, beautiful looking eye. If you look very closely at it, some people say you can see the entire galaxy. So next up is a very difficult piece of identification for fish in Utila, and that is the Porgies. And that is majorly because they all look very similar to one another, especially the pluma and saucer eye porgy. So the pluma porgy is named for the little plume that you find behind the eye, although sometimes that is nearly impossible to find on the fish. So another characteristic that you can look for in the saucer eye porgy, kind of differentiating the two, is the saucer eye porgy is not going to have that plume behind the eye, and it also has kind of like an indented kind of eye to it, but otherwise they look very similar to one another. The saucer eye porgy also has a little bit more of like a hump behind the eye as well. The jolthead porgy does look a little bit different from the pluma and saucer eye because of its brass kind of color all across the body. It really looks like it is painted in brass. The sheep's head porgy, sometimes you can see the black stripes very clearly and other times you can't, but it's always going to have those black bars across the body at varying shades of definedness. You can see it clearly some days and not clearly other days. It also has much thicker lips than the other types of porgies. Next is a big favorite on the reef if you've ever seen the Puff documentary. If you haven't, highly recommend it. The shark-nosed pufferfish, still having the this as the signal, and this as well. It's like a sharp nose. These guys are very small and you'll find them all over the reef. Sometimes you can't see that very ornate, elaborate blue patterning across the face, but if you look very closely you'll see it. You'll often find these guys all over in little crevices and along the walls of reefs. Next is not a native fish, but an invasive fish that you can still find here on Utila, and that is the lionfish. There are other types of scorpionfish that we find here, but we're not going to go over those in this presentation. But we do have the lionfish here in Utila. If you have heard anything about them before, they are invasive, they are rapidly reproducing, and all across the Caribbean they're a major problem because they have no predators and they eat anything and everything in their sight, causing a major disturbance to the local ecology of our coral reefs. The defining characteristics with a lionfish are their very, very contrasted orange to red stripes across the body, as well as the large fins and dorsal spines that they have, which are venomous and can be very painful if you were to run into one. Next up are the groupers. So this is the sign for groupers, underwater grouper or grouper. So we have some groupers that look quite similarly to one another. The Graysby and the red hind grouper look quite similar to one another, and let's take a moment to differentiate those. The Graysby grouper, the way that we distinguish that one from the red hind, because otherwise they look exactly the same, are there's 3 black dots on the dorsal side of the fish. So if you're trying to distinguish the two, make sure you take a second to really look at them and look for those black dots across the dorsal side of the fish. If you see them, Graysby grouper. If you don't, probably a red hind if it has those red spots all across the body. The red hind grouper has a little bit more yellow to it as well, which can help you differentiate the Graysby and the red hind. The tiger grouper is named for its large stripes across the body. There can be 9 to up to 13, varying in the number of stripes across the dorsal side. Otherwise, they have big orange dots across the face, and you will normally find 1 or 2 of them on the reef. The red grouper is one that we don't see very often here in Utila, but the red grouper doesn't have very much defined patterning across the body. They just have majorly just red across their bodies, giving them the name. They don't have very much patterning other than that. They can also get a little bit larger than the some of the other types of groupers on this page here. The coney grouper is one that is a little bit more unique from the other groupers in that they usually have a very stark contrast between their dorsal side and their underside. Normally you find them with that red across the back and then white across the stomach, although that can vary based on their mood and if they're darker, or based on if they're agitated or excited or something, then they might have a little bit different of a color. And then in the coney grouper, you can also find blue to darker kinds of colors of speckles all across the body. So next up, we have a few more groupers. So first is the Nassau grouper, and I always think of the Nassau grouper as having, like, in the Bahamas, I think of an airport, and the Nassau airport with landing strips across the face. Not the best way to remember it, but I don't know why that always comes to mind. They have a very defined 2 white stripes and 2 to 3 brown stripes across the face. They can also get quite large. Then we have the black grouper. The black grouper can get quite large as well, and they have black pectoral and dorsal, anal. All the fins have a little bit of black along them as well. The yellowfin grouper is named very simply for that very clear yellow line along the pectoral fins. Next we have some more types of serranids, and these are the hamlets and 2 other species of fish here. So all the hamlets here that you see on the left side of the screen are very similar looking to one another. I always think of them as literally like they are basically clones of one another, just different colors and patterns. So the one on the top left there is the barred hamlet. The barred hamlet has dark brown bars across the body, very simply named. Next is the indigo hamlet, which has those dark bars across the body as well, but it looks like they've been dipped in some blue dye. So they have a very unique, very rich, dark indigo color to them. Next is the shy hamlet, which has a dark color across the body as well as a yellow face, and they have a little teardrop kind of shape under the eyes, which make them look a little bit shy. This isn't the best, only thing to look for the shy hamlet, because there are some other hamlets on the island that also have that patch. So also pay attention to the dark color on the body, the yellow along the outsides, and the yellow on the face. Next is the black hamlet, which does look a lot like some of the damselfish that we've seen, but the black hamlet has a very different looking body shape, just like the other hamlets that we see here. Next is the tobaccofish, which is a very unique looking kind of fish compared to others that we've seen. The tobaccofish has a very kind of tobacco-ish kind of color to it, I think, with the dark orange across the body and then white to black speckles across the back. This is a very small fish, and you normally find them around sand patches. Next is the harlequin bass. The harlequin bass, I always think of Harley from Suicide Squad in being a very flamboyant and very kind of out there character with her personality. So the harlequin bass has very elaborate kind of out there patterns and colors on the body. They're quite small with a very angular, very pointed face. and you normally will find them around sand patches. Here is one more hamlet. This is the butter hamlet. This one is majorly gets its name from the kind of buttery kind of color across the body, and majorly no patterns across the body as well, besides that big black spotch on the caudal peduncle, right where the tail meets the body. Next is some snappers. So snapper, the sign for snapper underwater is this. Just very simply, you're snapping. So on the top left there, we have the schoolmaster, which sometimes likes to school, sometimes likes to be by itself. But the schoolmaster really has that American school bus kind of color to it, very, very bright yellow. And sometimes you'll see vertical stripes across the body as well. So then there is the yellowtail snapper. The yellowtail snapper, like I was talking about earlier, looks very similar to the yellow goatfish. However, the yellowtail snapper is going to be much more likely to be in the water column because this is where it typically feeds and lives its life. And they're also much more kind of football shaped, very much more rounded. The yellowtail goatfish, the yellow goatfish has those little extensions across the, or under the jaw, and they're also much closer to the sand. Next is the gray snapper. The gray snapper is very plain in coloration, but has the same kind of face and body as the other snappers. So that's something that you can use to identify this fish. They also tend to be sometimes gray, but also can be more on the orangey side, like this one here. Next is the mahogany snapper, which can look very similar to the gray snapper, except the mahogany snapper has a mahogany line along the end of the tail, as well as the outer edges of the dorsal fin. So next up we have a few more snappers. First is the dog snapper, which we always think of as just watched Marley and Me, so it's crying. Sometimes we'll do this for the dog snapper. They get very, very large. We often see them on our local shipwreck that we have here, and sometimes on the reef as well. This is one of the largest snappers that we have here. Another large snapper that we have here is the Cubera snapper, probably the very largest of all of the snappers here. The Cubera snapper almost looks like a grouper with its very grouper-like face and very large mouth and lips. That's one of the defining characteristics. You can also generally see the teeth pointing out of the mouth as well for the Cubera snapper. Another giveaway for the Cubera snapper is just its very large size. Then we have the mutton snapper. So the mutton snapper we always think of as mutton has a button, and that button is towards the back side of the, or towards the tail of the dorsal side of the fish. So you see that little black dot there? That's a mutton snapper. Next is another beautiful fish, and that is the spadefish, or the Atlantic spadefish here. So I sometimes do this sign underwater for a spadefish because they look a lot like a spade. The Atlantic spadefish is a unique fish in that they have those big black bars across the body, as well as the spade-like shape. You'll often see them in large schools, and you often find them on one of our dive sites here, Black Hills, which is why it's one of our favorites. They'll be in very large schools. You can also very infrequently find them alone or just with one or two or three, but very much more often they're in large schools. So next up we have the surgeonfish. We do this sign underwater like a surgeon doing surgery of scalpel across the body. The surgeonfish are named for their very unique adaptation that they have. All three of them have it. It's called a scalpel. Towards the tail, you'll see that they've got this kind of diamond-like shape towards the tail. That is called a scalpel. So that scalpel can be used in combat with different males to basically fight for a mate. Or they could also be using that to defend themselves from predators. It's a very sharp extension that can cause pretty intense lacerations on predators if they attempt to eat them. So the first surgeonfish that we're going to talk about is the blue tang. So one of the cutest fish on the reef for sure as a juvenile, a favorite to point out. They are, as a juvenile, they are yellow and very round in shape. As an adult, that yellow gets concentrated just at the scalpel there, and the body is majorly blue. But one of the biggest characteristics that you can look for to distinguish the blue tang from the other surgeonfish is definitely that yellow scalpel towards the tail. That's a very different color than the other scalpels that you see in other surgeonfish. So then we have the ocean surgeonfish here, which can look very similarly to the others here. But the ocean surgeonfish has no pattern across the body, and they're going to have a very dark scalpel, very dark blue scalpel. The doctorfish, however, is going to have vertical stripes across the body, and sometimes they'll have a bright blue outline along the scalpel. We always think of the doctorfish as when you go to the doctor, you commonly wait in line, so you see the vertical lines along the doctorfish. But just make sure when you are trying to distinguish between an ocean surgeonfish and a doctorfish that you take a second to really look for those vertical lines. If they have them, it is likely, it's definitely a doctorfish. If they don't, it's likely an ocean surgeonfish. So next we have some squirrelfish. Here, the squirrelfish are known for their very large eyes. They have those very large eyes because these are majorly nocturnal fish, so they need those very large eyes to be able to see in the night. So during the day, you'll often find them in caves and crevices, hanging out away from everything else to kind of sleep during the day to save their energy for the night. So the long spine squirrelfish and the long jaw squirrelfish, differentiating the two, you'll notice that the long spine squirrelfish has a little bit longer of spines along the back, but those spines are also white in coloration. The long spine squirrelfish has a dorsal fin that is majorly white. The long jaw squirrelfish is named for their very elongated face compared to the long spine squirrelfish, which is a little bit more squirrely, a little bit shorter. The long jaw squirrelfish also has a yellow dorsal fin and yellow spines along the dorsal side. Next we have the tilefish, which is the common one here is the sand tilefish. It's very torpedo-like in shape, and they very much they will use that dorsal fin and that lower anal fin to swim as well. So you'll see it kind of like waving like a worm through the water. They really don't have very much patterning across their body. They're just majorly a white fish. Next is the triggerfish. So this is the signal for triggerfish underwater. We have several species of triggerfish here. One of the favorites is the black durgan. So the black durgan, you normally can't see any patterning on the body or any colors other than black. Normally the light really doesn't catch that color and pattern on the body, so it'll normally be like night dark black. One of the big distinguishing characteristics for the black durgan is definitely those bright light white lines. They're whitish to blue, very bright lines across the upper and lower fins here that almost look like they're detaching the fins from the body. You'll often find them in large schools on the island and normally in the water column floating around. And even when you moor up to a dive site, a lot of times they'll come up right to your boat and just hang out right under your boat. The queen triggerfish is named quite similarly to the other queens here, having the most elaborate colors and patterns of all the triggerfish. So the queen triggerfish has very dainty kind of fins with much very long extensions to them, and they also have lots of, you could think of it as eye makeup on their eyes and lots of lipstick, lots of colors. Beautiful fish that you usually will find alone. So next is the ocean triggerfish, another super cool fish to find on the reef. You normally just will find one of them. We sometimes do this for ocean triggerfish because they will, like this. They will swim like this on the reef. They'll use that upper and lower fin to majorly swim, and they won't really use that tail. They also look a whole lot like the mola mola. commonly mistaken for the mola mola or the sunfish. The ocean triggerfish is much smaller than the mola mola and also found at a very different place on the reef, where the sunfish is usually in the open ocean. Next are the wrasses. We do a big W for wrasses underwater. One of the most common wrasses on Utila is definitely the Creole wrasse. The Creole wrasse you can find in massive schools, and it can be super beautiful, amazing experience to have a large school of Creole wrasse come over you, because it can just be all of a sudden your world is filled with blue, a dark blue kind of mesmerizing pattern across your field of view. They're super cool. The Creole wrasse, we sometimes do this underwater for this guy because he's got a little black mustache just above the mouth. As a juvenile, you will often see some of these crazy oranges and pinks and purples, kind of like splatter painted across the body as well. But in the adult, you will see the dark blue across the whole body. Next we have the yellowhead wrasse. The yellowhead wrasse is named very simply for that yellow head. They look very different from the other types of wrasses that you'll see. Then the bluehead wrasse, which has a very dark blue head, very simply named. You'll notice that with all of the wrasses that you see here, they generally have a very cigar-like kind of shape that is unique to the wrasses. You'll notice that in all the groups of fish here, they all have a very similar type of shape to their body. And once you really start to learn that, it becomes a lot easier to do kind of process of elimination of what kind of fish it is. So the wrasses have a very elongated kind of cigar-like shape to them. So next we have some more wrasses. So first up on the top left there is a rainbow wrasse, which has a beautiful green pattern or green color across the body and red across the dorsal and anal fin. And then towards the tail you have a big black splotch. Next is the very interestingly named slippery dick, a type of fish that you will often find in sand patches. If you kind of move around the sand a little bit, they will quickly come over to your fins, quickly come over to the sand, moving around to check out any prey that have emerged from the sand. They're very opportunistic. The slippery dick, the characteristics that make this fish unique are the very cotton candy-like colors and patterns across the body. You usually see yellows and greens, very pastel-y kinds of colors across the body. And they just have a very blended kind of coloration to the body. It kind of helps them blend into sand patches nearby reefs. Next is the largest, or one of the largest wrasses that we have here in Utila, and that's the pudding wife. So the pudding wife looks a whole lot like a parrotfish. However, the mouth is quite different. The parrotfish has a beak to help them crunch away at algae and peck at the reef for corals. The pudding wife has a mouth with teeth in it that help it eat different kinds of prey. So the pudding wife, I always like to think of it as they have 3 scoops of pudding out of the dorsal side of the fish, because you can see 3 to 4 even iridescent blue patches across the dorsal side. And you also will normally see a little bit more bright blue iridescent kind of patterning across the body and the face as well, even in the juveniles. So next up is the clown wrasse. The clown wrasse is named for that very clown-like face with a very crazy pattern, and it looks like they have put a lot of clown makeup on their face. The rest of their body tends to have a little bit of pink and purple as well. So next up, all the way on the right there, are the hogfish. And the hogfish are named for that very large snout that is used to clamp down on and crunch larger types of prey. So the large regular hogfish you have there on the top right, that is the full adult version. The other version that you'll see here on the reefs is quite bright orange, and they'll have yellow kind of spines coming off the top of the head as well. Next up is the Spanish hogfish. The Spanish hogfish will have a dark purple patch across the top side of the body and a yellow underside to the body. The Spanish hogfish is also much smaller than the other hogfish. The Spanish hogfish normally gets about this big, which is, yeah, much smaller than the other hogfish here. So next we have some other fish that we're going to label to the just the family level, and the first one there is chubs. So chubs will generally be seen in larger schools, and they really do look like a chubby fish. They're quite round if you look at them head on, and they also have a very bird-like face with a little beak, it looks like. Next are the gobies. The gobies you will commonly find along corals. They're very small, and they will commonly reside directly on top of a live coral. Next is pipefish. These are quite difficult to find, and there are very many species of them. Some of the ones that I have been able to find are normally in sand patches. Next are seahorses. So the seahorse and the pipefish look quite similar to one another, except the pipefish is very much thinner and much like a pipe. The seahorse is much more of what you would expect for a seahorse, with the curly tail, the larger stomach, and the curved kind of horse-like appearance of the face and the head. You'll often find seahorses hanging on to small kind of string-like or bar-like things, which give them a little bit more stability. Things like sea plumes or sea fans or algae, or even the ropes on docks, they really like to hang on to those rope-like things on the reef. Next up is the trumpetfish. This is the sign for trumpetfish on the reef, another favorite to point out. Very unique looking fish, and how extremely long they are, with a very large snout. Next is the blennies. The blennies are characterized by their very large circular pectoral fins, a very box-like shaped face, and the tail and the dorsal fin also being quite large for the size of the body. These are quite smaller fish compared to other kinds of fish, and they spend a lot of their time towards the bottom of the reef on the seafloor. Next we have some other fun, larger things that we see on the reef, the first of which being the so all of these are the Elasmobranchs that we see commonly on the reef, the first of which is the yellow stingray. This is the smallest stingray that we have here in Utila, and they always are about the size of a large pancake, as my colleague Abby likes to say. The yellow stingray has bright yellow splotches all across the back, and a very unique kind of maze-like pattern across the body. They're also just quite small. Next is the southern stingray. The southern stingray and the next stingray that we're going to talk about down in the bottom right there look quite similarly to one another, except the southern stingray has a pointed front to the body. Whereas the stingray down there in the bottom right, which I'm going to talk about in a second, has a very rounded front to the body. The spotted eagle ray is a beautiful type of elasmobranch that we find here commonly on the reefs, named for its spotted pattern across the back and its eagle-like, bird-like face with it looks like a beak. You'll commonly find them off the reef, floating along the sides, gliding past as if they're flying. Next up is the nurse shark, which is a little bit different from the other sharks that you might know and love, but the nurse shark is characterized by its brown coloration, its very rounded kind of face, very long tail, and the little appendages that you see on the mouth as well. They're quite different looking from many other sharks. They also will spend a majority of their time towards the seafloor. Next is the whiptail stingray. So the whiptail, like I was mentioning, looks a whole lot like the southern stingray, except the whiptail is going to have that rounded front of the fish, as well as the tail is a little bit thicker, but it's hard to kind of differentiate that They also have a very thick kind of body, whereas the southern stingray is a little bit thinner. But I think the best characteristic to look for is that rounded off front to the body versus the pointed in the southern stingray. So some other things that we identified to the family level is another type of scorpionfish. There's many different types of scorpionfish here, but labeled to the family level, sometimes you'll find the scorpionfish just out on a sand patch, just alone. Other times you'll find it on the reef. They blend in quite well, and they are also quite venomous, so an important thing to look out for. Next is frogfish. I have yet to find one, but a very unique kind of fish that can blend into its surroundings very, very easily and have a very wide range in the types of colors and patterns that they have in their body. This one is resembling a yellow sponge. Others can have all kinds of crazy different kinds of colors and patterns to blend in all kinds of different things. Next is the stargazer. This is commonly found in sand patches buried underneath sand, as you can see from its mouth and eyes that are really geared towards the top of its body. It uses that advantage to bury itself in the sand so it can breathe and look for prey to come along and for it to ambush it. Next is the toadfish. Sorry, that is buried behind that picture. But that is the bearded toadfish, named for the big beard along its face. Normally they are kind of buried into a crevice. You really never see the backside of the body, the tail. Normally you just see the front there, just the face and that big beard on the face as well. Then you have the burrfish there. That's another type of pufferfish. The burrfish has very large, kind of like horns, it looks like, on the front of the body. And also the spines on the burrfish stick out a little bit more than something like the balloonfish. So that was the completion of our fish ID lecture. That was all the fish. That was over 100 species, so congratulations for getting this far. I know it is a whole lot. If you would like to continue learning more fish or reviewing them, you can revisit this video anytime that you want, or revisit this presentation. Reefguide.org is a really great resource. Also reef.org/quizzes. We also have a Quizlet that we created. It's under Wazork staff in Quizlet. We'll go ahead and link that below if you want to go ahead and practice. But otherwise, that was the completion of this very long video, so thank you for sticking with me this entire thing. If you're interested in learning more, definitely follow us on Instagram and check out our website, the Whale Shark Center. And otherwise, stay tuned for the next videos where I'm going to be posting more identification for our reef-associated organisms and our coral species that we have here in Utila as well. So, if you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. Otherwise, we will see you in the next one. Thank you guys so much for watching.